Okay, so welcome. So I'm going to talk about remote design sprints, lesson from a brave new remote world. I'll run through some lessons if you're thinking of running some remote design sprints, including when to run them, as opposed to maybe an in-person design sprint, and then some tips for running your own design sprint. So firstly, I've got a question for you. So even if you're not a football fan, I suspect that you'll probably have watched a game of football, even if it's only every 4 years at the World Cup. So if you're looking to watch a game of football, I've got two options for you. Either one, you can watch the game of football at the stadium, or two, you have the option of watching it in the comfort of your own home. And I want you to think about, what your preference would be. And I've asked this question at a number of conferences, and generally the most people say, well, actually, I prefer to watch a game of football at the stadium. And kind of a follow-up question for you as well. So if you've got the choice of doing a workshop in person or doing that workshop remotely, would you rather do an in-person workshop, so physically in person with people, or a remote workshop over Teams or Zoom or that sort of thing? And again, I've asked this same question, and I think it's fair to say that whilst there's some people that prefer remote workshops, more people prefer in-person workshops. And I think this is interesting because here we're looking at in-person versus remote, and certainly when it comes to design sprints. And it's clear that some things maybe people have a preference for in-person, some things people have a preference for remote. But before we look at that, let's remind ourselves what a design sprint is. So a design sprint is defined, so Wikipedia at least defines a design sprint as a time-constrained process that uses design thinking with the aim of reducing the risk when bringing a new product, service, or a feature to the market. And it's worth saying that design sprints are nothing new. Teams have been doing design sprint type activities for years. If you don't believe me, check out this video from 1999, so nearly 25 years ago, of the design team at IDEO, the famous American design consultancy, doing a week-long exercise to redesign shopping carts. In the video, they call it a deep dive, but really it has all the hallmarks of what we would now call a design sprint. So cross-functional team and sort of 1 week time box exercise, rapid ideation and validation of ideas, that sort of thing. And really the term design sprint, comes from this book, Sprint, by Jake Knapp. Obviously, Jake was a designer and startup advisor at Google, and he wanted a playbook that teams could use to rapidly tackle a design challenge. So he and his team came up with the idea of a sprint, a way for teams to supposedly solve big problems and test new ideas in just 5 days. And as per the sprint book, design sprints are typically spread over 5 days. They're run in person with teams spending the week choosing which part of a problem to focus on, coming up with potential solutions, generating prototypes, test ideas, and then testing those ideas with target customers. I'm a big fan of design sprints. So I've run numerous design sprints, a number of companies, and they can be a really great way to tackle problems. But given that design sprints were designed to be carried out in person, they were never designed with remote working in mind, can they still work when done remotely? And I think it's fair to say that Jake Knapp, who wrote that sprint book, maybe doesn't seem to think so. As he says, I've heard stories of people running successful remote sprints, but to be honest, I never totally believed it. Part of the sprint magic is being in the same room. So the question was, well, can you still, can they still be as effective, and can you still have that same magic when a design sprint is carried out remotely? And thanks to sort of COVID and the pandemic of a number of years ago now, I was going to find this out because it meant that 2 design sprints that ordinarily I'd run in person, I had to run remotely. And I'm going to run through some key lessons that I learned from those 2 remote design sprints. But before I run through those, I should kind of set the context in terms of what those design sprints were covering. So each of the design sprints was tackling slightly different problems. So the first was exploring how to better support enterprise customers and their needs for a large enterprise product. And then the second one was exploring how to make it easier for new users of a product to get started. And again, just to provide context, there was actually a bit of a gap between those two remote design sprints, with a kind of time to reflect and retrospect about the first design sprint. So initially ran that enterprise design sprint, learned some lessons there, tweaked things, and then ran the onboarding design sprint. And each sprint was carried out completely remotely, largely using Zoom, and each design sprint had a cross-functional team of designers, engineers, and product managers. And each design sprint heavily utilized Mural, very similar to Miro if you've used it. So it's an online collaboration tool, and really using it as a virtual whiteboard. So I'll talk about some of the key lessons from running those design sprints. Before I do, it's probably worth asking the question, well, when is the right time to run a design sprint? In those instances, there wasn't the option to run it in person. It was lockdown in the UK, couldn't come into the office and work face to face with people. But obviously, that's not that's no longer the case. There is now the option to run things in person or remotely. So when we're talking about whether to run design sprint in person or remotely, my personal preference is generally to run things like workshops in person. Certainly, if I'm going to a football match, I'd rather go to the stadium. So for a lot of things, and again, there's a lot of instances where my preference would be to run a design sprint in person, but I think there's also situations where a remote design sprint makes a lot of sense. So, for example, most obvious of this is if you have a very distributed team. So, for example, I've previously worked at organizations where you've got people, from all over the world coming in. It can be very expensive, very disruptive, not to mention not very great for the environment to, fly people from all over the world together for a design sprint. So in that instance, a remote design sprint makes a lot of sense. If there are a lot of stakeholders as well, then it can be much easier for them to join a remote design sprint remotely. Certainly, if it's only for maybe a few hours or an afternoon, because again, they're just a click away from it rather than having to physically come to a where the design sprint is taking place. But on the other hand, if you have a very open-ended kind of problem that you're tackling, quite an open-ended design sprint, I think that's the sort of thing where actually it can be easier to do that sort of design sprint in person. If there's a lot of, requires a lot of kind of discussion, a lot of, workshopping, so to speak, that is easier to do in person than remote. I think certainly in my experience as well. And if you've got a team with no experience of working remotely, again, probably throwing them straight into a remote design sprint probably isn't the best option. Although I think it's fair to say that rather than, should this be remote or should this be in person, actually taking a bit of a hybrid approach can work really well. So maybe carry out some of the design sprint in person and then some of the design sprint remotely. So for example, you might have the first part of the design sprint in person where there's a great need for a lot of collaboration and sort of workshopping, discussing. And then the second part of the design sprint, building a prototype, testing it with target users, that could be done remotely. And with remote design tools like Figma and remote user testing, it can be quite easy to remotely collaborate on building a prototype and testing a prototype. So assuming that it makes sense to run a remote design sprint, or at least aspects of a design sprint remotely, here are some key things to think about. So I've kind of distilled some 10 key lessons that I learned from those 2 remote design sprints. And the first of those involves pizzas and Jeff Bezos' famous 2 pizza principle for meetings. If you can't feed a meeting with 2 pizzas, it's too large. Now, I think Jeff has a point here. you don't want too many people in your meetings, otherwise they become unwieldy. And the same, I think, is true of remote design sprints. So for both remote design sprints, had relatively small teams, as I say, cross-functional teams. 6 for the enterprise design sprint, 8 for the onboarding sprint. And I think Jeff, would be delighted to know that, should be able to feed a team of 6 or a team of 8 with 2 pizzas, as long as they're good-sized pizzas, not those really tiny ones. In fact, I'd say that a small team is probably more important for a remote design sprint than an in-person design sprint, because collaboration, discussion, it can be a little bit harder, a bit more friction when you're not in the room, when you're doing it remotely. So the fewer people, that can really help there. But again, you want to find that sweet spot. So about 6 people, 5, 6, 7 people often works really well. So my first tip, if you're running remote design sprints, is to try and keep those numbers small. So think about Jeff and his 2 pizzas. 5 to 8 people is probably a good range to aim for. Now also, so I spoke of 2 remote design sprints, and one of the key differences between those 2 remote design sprints was the duration. So first one was actually run over 2 weeks rather than the usual 1 week. And I'll talk about why that is in a bit. And then the second one was run over just 4 days. So the first design sprint was actually over 2 weeks for 2 key reasons. So one was kind of in the anticipation that things can take a little bit longer when done remotely. So just to provide a bit of that breathing room, but also to give a bit more time to actually prototype and to test with customers as part of that initial design sprint. Especially, it was quite hard to recruit and get time with enterprise customers that we wanted to test with. Because again, in my experience, having that second week allows for prototyping and testing with users, allows for a more realistic prototype to be created and to be tested and evaluated with users. I think the risk is when you try and cram that all into 4 days or 5 days, is it can feel a little bit like, you have to quickly scrabble a prototype together, test something, and you're really testing something that's quite crude and kind of early, and maybe just spending a little bit more time can really help there. So 2 weeks just gives teams a bit more time to create a more realistic prototype. They have days to do that rather than hours necessarily, and don't have to kind of have something which is a bit scrappy and rough and ready. And also splitting over 2 weeks, it allows for those testing, those tests with customers or sort of prototype evaluations to be trialed and iterated. Maybe if you're running testing over a couple of days, over 2 days, you can run some tests, iterate the prototype, iterate how those tests are set up and sessions, and then run them again. It provides a bit more room for practice and refinement, again, rather than cramming it all into 1 week where it can all feel a bit rushed. So my second tip for remote design sprints is to think about splitting over 2 weeks. And that might not be necessary for every remote design sprint or even every in-person design sprint. But I think it can often be very useful in terms of giving a bit more time to create and test a realistic prototype. And certainly if recruiting and getting hold of users is difficult, again, it gives a bit more time to do that. So when you're running a remote design sprint, and I guess as if you're working remotely in general, you can have synchronous activities such as workshops and collaborative design sessions, or asynchronous activities, maybe where you divide and conquer tasks and then come together as a group to discuss. So for example, reviewing something or creating aspects of a prototype and then coming back together to review. And so for the first remote design sprint, looking at the improving a product for enterprise customers, the majority of those activities were synchronous. So getting together as a group to workshop something, to discuss something, to all work together on something. And when you're working remotely, that can be mentally quite taxing. So for the second remote design sprint, we actually had more of a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous activities. So for example, agreeing the basic flow for a prototype, so that then the team could go away, asynchronously work on aspects of that, using something like Figma where you can easily collaborate, and then coming back together to discuss. So my kind of third tip and lesson for remote design sprints is to think about having a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous activities. You don't always have to do something synchronously, and think about, well, actually, what's the right mix here? Are there some things, should we be working all together as a team on something, or can we actually divide and conquer? Can we work on this asynchronously? And also, as I mentioned, I don't know if your experience of doing things remotely, Zoom meetings and workshops and what have you, is that they can be mentally quite taxing, probably more so than working in person. Maybe because working remotely is maybe not so natural, and screen fatigue and all that sort of thing. And this is something I certainly noticed again for the first design sprint. It was very mentally, even physically taxing, spending, all day online, working remotely, collaborating with people. So for the second design sprint, very intentionally had shorter sessions with more breaks to help keep energy levels high. So for example, making sure that we were going no longer than 45 minutes without a break, and having more of a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous sessions. And so my fourth tip is to think of keeping those remote sessions short, keeping the energy levels up. Ideally having a short break every 45 to 60 minutes. I think that's really important, for when you're doing things remotely. Now, when it comes to facilitating a design sprint, facilitating a kind of an in-person design sprint is, it's tricky if you've ever had to do that in terms of, keeping things flowing and organized. Doing that remotely and facilitating a remote design sprint is even harder. It's harder to read the room. It's harder to often, keep track of what's going on. And, there can be a technology barrier in terms of using the tools. So this is often where it's useful if you've got a group, is to split that group into smaller groups. This is where it's a great idea to have a co-facilitator for remote design sprints. So this can make it easier to run activities and to generally keep things running. So I didn't actually have a co-facilitator for that first remote design sprint, and really kind of suffered, I guess, because of that, because in terms of the challenge of facilitating. So whilst I didn't have a permanent co-facilitator for that second design sprint, I ensured that I got help running activities, and kind of almost had a panel of people to help co-facilitate during that session. So my fifth tip is I definitely recommend organizing a co-facilitator or even co-facilitators when you're running remote design sprints, just because the challenge of facilitating is that bit harder. So I've already mentioned that doing things remotely can be mentally, maybe even physically very taxing. And I think, the truth is that humans are not, we've not evolved to do things over computer screen. We naturally communicate face to face, and even video calls, Zoom calls, they can feel quite unnatural. And for the first remote design sprint, as I mentioned, we did a lot of sort of synchronous activities, a lot of activities as a group of 6, and looked to change that approach for the second design sprint by carrying out more activities in pairs or even asynchronously. So, for example, reviewing competing solutions in pairs rather than one big group and then coming back together to review what pairs have found out. So, and again, talking about, synchronous and asynchronous in the blend, I think there's a lot of things that, you should be doing as a group and are best done as a group. But I'd also recommend utilizing pairs, or again finding that mix. So, do we have to do this as a group? Can we have smaller groups, maybe pair up or small groups of 3 for tasks? Because again, that can really help in terms of that collaboration when working remotely. And when it comes to design sprints, whether you're running them remotely or in person, planning is very, very important. As the old saying goes, failing to plan is planning to fail. And I think this is especially important for remote design sprints, which they, arguably probably require even more planning than doing things in person. And that's in part because it's actually much harder to make it up as you go along. If you're an experienced facilitator, you can probably wing aspects of a in-person design sprint. It's much harder to do that remotely. If you haven't got the template set up, if you haven't got the things set up, if you haven't got a good plan in terms of how activities are going to be run. For both of these remote design sprints, some of that key planning, including creating things like briefing material before the design sprints, having kickoff sessions with the team involved, to start to build a shared understanding of the problem, and of goals, scope, plan, ways of working, that sort of thing. I also spend a lot of time preparing online boards before the sessions. So making sure that those boards are set up and the material, the resources already set up. Rather than creating lots of different online boards, I'd recommend creating just the one big board. And this means that everything can be seen together. There's no confusion over which board do we go to for this or what have you. And it just keeps everything in one place. It's a bit like the virtual equivalent of a design sprint war room with sketches, post-it notes, and screenshots stuck to the walls. And another good little tip is to create swim lanes, or whether they're horizontal or vertical swim lanes for each participant. And this ensures that everyone has a space on the board for their input. So, for example, this is a classic how might we ideation type exercise, and everyone has an area where they can add their ideas. So my 7th tip is to prepare material and to brief participants beforehand so they know what to expect and can carry out any any homework that might be necessary before the design sprint. So, for example, reading up on previous insights, or maybe reviewing competing solutions or designs. And I think if you're when you're working remotely, it can be tempting to multitask. I'm sure I'm certainly have been guilty of this. I'm sure you have as well. When you're supposed to be on a remote meeting with someone, maybe checking your emails, checking your socials, or even maybe cooking up a little snack. Keeping yourself energized. And I think this is why it's really important to set ground rules for remote design sprints. So, in terms of what are some of those guiding principles, what are some of those expectations? And that might be something as simple as, trying to make sure that everyone has their webcam on where possible, or making sure that we're making quick decisions rather than being 100% correct, or encouraging people to voice their opinion, making sure there's no such thing as a bad idea. With the most important, to be excellent to each other, whether you're doing a design sprint in person or remotely, in terms of that trust, that respect. So 8th tip, I think it's really important to set the house rules for remote design sprints. And that's true of in-person design sprints as well, but certainly for remote design sprints, to make sure that everyone knows what those rules are and have actively, almost kind of signed up. And okay, you don't need their physical signatures, but to make sure that everyone is in agreement and aware of what they are, what's expected of them. And also, when you're running a remote design sprint, the tools you use can really make or break that sprint. If you've got video calls that keep dropping out, or design tools that are not good fit for working remotely, you're not going to get as much out of that design sprint as you hope for. And it's really important that the tools you use are designed with remote working in mind. So for the first sprint, we heavily utilized Mural, which is an online collaboration tool, very similar to Miro if you've used that, or even FigJam. But for the second sprint, we used additional tools to help drive some of that remote collaboration. So utilize Figma for real-time design collaboration, to create a prototype, to review a prototype, and even use PowerPoint to collaborate on a presentation deck in real time to help showcase and present back within the organization as to what happened. So another tip is to utilize remote collaboration tools such as Mural, Miro, Figma, and even Office applications. And this can make it easier to collaborate remotely if you've got the right tools and the right technology. And then my final tip covers sharing your work during a design sprint. So if you're doing a design sprint in person, you can often stick lots of things up in the room you're working in. And this makes it easier to keep things in mind, or to take someone through what the team's been doing. But unfortunately, for remote design sprints, that's not so easy. You can have a virtual room, so to speak, but you can't have a physical room where you can showcase this stuff. And I think this is why during the second remote design sprint, we had a show and tell, not just at the end of the sprint, but midway through as well. And this was a great way to show stakeholders what has happened in that sprint. And in fact, if you're doing a remote design sprint over 2 weeks, you might even have a show and tell after the first week and then after the second week. So my final tip is to provide updates during remote design sprints. And like I say, not just at the end, maybe updates within the sprint as well. So I've run through some tips for running remote design sprints, but again, coming back to that almost initial question of, can they work? Can you get the same magic from remote design sprints? Well, as we saw, Jake Knapp himself, doesn't seem so sure. As he said, I've heard stories of people running successful remote design sprints, but to be honest, I never totally believed it. But I think it's fair to say that even Jake now, he seems to think that remote design sprints can work. As he says, people have done remote design sprints literally thousands of times with great outcomes. And certainly my own experience, I think I'd agree with that. So this was certainly borne out by the 2 remote design sprints that I've spoken about. Okay, both had their challenges, but ultimately proved successful. With the enterprise design sprint, we were able to test lots of ideas with enterprise customers, and to help inform that product roadmap on the back of that. And then with the onboarding design sprint that was kind of 6 months later, we're able to test lots of ideas, including an interactive online onboarding tutorial. Although because that was run in a very compressed, so just 4 days rather than 5 days, it did make less time to actually explore different ideas and get feedback for different ideas. So again, I'd certainly recommend 5 days a minimum, and ideally kind of 2 weeks for a remote design sprint if possible. So I've looked at what remote design sprints are, how they compare in person, and some tips when running them. And I'll kind of run through, and again, just a quick recap. So in terms of the question of when to run a remote design sprint in person or remotely, well, it's not, I don't think it's a case of one being better than the other. There are times when it makes sense to run a design sprint in person, and there are times when it makes sense to run a design sprint remotely. Like I said, if you've got a very distributed team and it's complicated to bring people together, or you've got a stakeholders that you want to easily bring into that process. The important thing is that you actively think about the best approach to take, and you plan out your design sprint accordingly. So it's not a question of, right, every design sprint has to be in person, every design sprint has to be remote. And as I said, you can have maybe a combination of the two. You might run the first bit in person, second bit remotely. And if you are going to run a remote design sprint, let's quickly recap those 10 tips. So firstly, keep those numbers small. So think about Jeff and his 2 pizza rule. That's a good thing for remote design sprints. Also around kind of splitting over 2 weeks. So, it can be a real challenge to compress everything to 1 week. 2 weeks gives a bit more breathing room and opportunity to create realistic prototypes and test those with customers. I think it's really important to have a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous activities when working remotely, because trying to do everything synchronously can be quite a challenge and can be quite mentally taxing. And because working remotely can be, mentally, even physically quite taxing, it's important to keep those remote sessions short. So ideally, no more than 45, 60 minutes between breaks. Facilitating remote design sprints is challenging. So, it's a good idea to have co-facilitator or facilitators if you can. And again, when you're doing things as a group, maybe think about, well, do we need to do this all as a group? Can we divide and conquer? Can we maybe split up into pairs or small groups? Because again, that can help in terms of that collaboration if you're working remotely. Really important to prepare material and brief participants beforehand. So in terms of that, things like templates or previous insights for people to review, also guidelines around how the design sprint will work, or expectations for people taking part. Really important to set those house rules. Like I say, set those expectations. That can be something as simple as trying to make sure that people have their webcam on, or that they respect each other. And the tools, the technology can be really key. So really thinking about using the best tools, making sure that they're working and that they're reliable and people know how to use them. And then finally, can be a good idea to provide updates not just at the end but during a design sprint, because it's harder to showcase, it's harder to take someone through what's been done, and the artifacts, the things that have been generated. So if you want to find out more about remote design sprints, there's an excellent remote design sprint guide online. So this is a collection of tips and advice from the same authors of the original sprint book. And the guide also includes templates for popular online collaboration tools such as Miro and Mural. So yeah, again, really useful. So yeah, I'd encourage you, have a go at running a remote design sprint, think about those tips, and yeah, get stuck in. Thank you very much.